The smell of gun oil lingered thick in the air, the metallic tang of steel mixing with the faint musk of old sawdust that clung to the firing range walls. Fluorescent lights hummed above, washing everything in a sterile white glow that made the guns gleam like predators resting in the shadows. She walked in quietly, her steps measured, her eyes scanning the room with the kind of calm that came from knowing she had nothing to prove yet everything to gain. At the far end of the room stood a cluster of men, broad-shouldered and loud, their laughter carrying over the pop of gunfire from the stalls. They turned almost in unison when they noticed her presence, and it was him, the tallest of the bunch, with a buzz cut and a smirk carved deep into his face, who raised an eyebrow, lips curling into mock amusement. "Here for the knitting class, sweetheart?" he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. A few of the others chuckled, elbowing each other like boys in a locker room. She didn't flinch. She merely walked to the counter, slid her paperwork across without hesitation, and requested a lane. The range officer looked between her and the group, sensing the tension thickening in the air, but shrugged. Business was business, and everyone had a right to fire if they had the paperwork. Still, the officer's eyes lingered on her just a moment longer, as though silently questioning whether she really knew what she was getting herself into. The man with the smirk wasn't done. He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest, the glint of dog tags flashing briefly from beneath his shirt. Military, or at least a veteran, he wore his arrogance like a badge, as if his time served gave him dominion over this space. "What's it gonna be then?" he asked. "You want the smallest caliber we got, or you here to watch the real shooters work?" His buddies laughed again, not cruelly but dismissively, as though they already knew the outcome. She met his gaze, her face unreadable, and answered in a tone so calm it silenced them for a brief second. "I'll take the .45, she said. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. The smirk on his face twitched, not fading but faltering just enough for his buddies to notice. The .45 wasn't a beginner's weapon. Heavy recoil, unforgiving kick, loud enough to rattle the bones of someone not prepared. He was expecting her to ask for a .22, maybe a 9mm, something soft, manageable. But she hadn't even blinked. The officer behind the counter raised an eyebrow but complied, setting down the weapon and box of rounds. She collected them without hesitation, turned and walked toward her lane. The men followed with their eyes, muttering under their breath. The smirking one, his name she would later learn was Carter, whispered just loud enough for his group to hear, "This ought to be good." They lined up behind their lanes, occasionally peeking over at hers like spectators waiting for a show. She could feel their eyes drilling into her back, but she didn't acknowledge them. Instead, she set down the case, clipped on her ear protection, slid her safety glasses into place, and began with a ritualistic precision. She checked the weapon, ran her fingers across the slide, inspected the magazine, and with practiced ease, loaded the first round. Every movement was deliberate, efficient, and devoid of hesitation. Carter noticed. His smirk lingered, but now his eyes had narrowed, his amusement mixing with a trace of suspicion. She looked too comfortable, too familiar with the process, and yet he dismissed it as good form picked up from YouTube tutorials or some training class at best. No amount of classroom learning could prepare someone for the thunder of a .45 on their first live fire. The lane lights flickered as she stepped forward, squared her stance and raised the weapon. Her grip was textbook, elbows slightly bent, shoulders relaxed, eyes locked down the sights as though she had been doing this her whole life. The paper target dangled 50 feet away, a faceless silhouette waiting to be punched through. Behind her, Carter whispered something about bracing for the recoil, his friends chuckling again, but their laughter was cut short when the first shot erupted. The explosion cracked through the room like lightning, reverberating off the concrete walls, but her body didn't flinch, not even an inch. The muzzle rose and snapped back down in perfect control, her arms absorbing the shock with smooth precision. A neat, jagged hole appeared dead center in the chest of the target, the red bullseye torn through like tissue paper. For a moment, silence flooded the range, the other shooters pausing mid-action to glance over. She fired again, another thunderous blast, and the target shuddered as a second hole punctured just millimeters from the first, so close it looked like the same shot had split itself into two. By the time she sent the third round screaming downrange, the paper center had begun to disintegrate, a ragged black wound expanding where the bullseye used to be. The men behind her didn't laugh this time. One of them let out a low whistle, the kind reserved for moments when words fell short. Carter's smirk had vanished completely, replaced with a taut jaw and narrowed eyes, his pride shifting uncomfortably under the weight of reality. She continued, round after round, each shot placed with uncanny precision, each recoil controlled with mechanical ease. It wasn't just skill, it was muscle memory, the kind that only came from years of drilling, years of training where mistakes weren't tolerated because mistakes got people killed. She emptied the magazine, dropped it cleanly, reloaded, and kept firing, her focus never wavering, her rhythm steady as a heartbeat. When she finally lowered the weapon, smoke curling from the barrel, the paper target looked like it had been chewed through by fire. Not a single shot strayed far from center mass. The officer from the counter had stepped closer, arms crossed, eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and respect. The other shooters in the room, men who minutes ago had dismissed her, now watched in silence, their expressions shifting from amusement to admiration to unease. She cleared the weapon, set it down with care, and finally turned to face them. Her expression hadn't changed. Calm, steady, unreadable. She removed her glasses, lifted the ear protection from her head, and met Carter's eyes directly. For a long, heavy moment no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights and the acrid hiss of spent gunpowder still lingering in the air. Then she said, quietly but firmly, "Was that good enough for you?" The words cut through the silence sharper than any bullet had. Carter opened his mouth, but no words came out. His friends exchanged glances, their smirks gone, replaced with an uneasy respect. And though no one would admit it aloud, the balance in the room had shifted entirely. Carter forced a laugh after a long pause, but it was hollow, strained, the kind of sound people made when they were trying to convince themselves of something they no longer believed. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, though even as he said it, his voice betrayed him. Nobody answered him. His buddies stayed silent, still staring at the target that looked like it had been drilled by a machine. The officer pulled the pulley system and reeled the paper back toward them. When it came to a stop, the evidence was undeniable, a cluster of shots so tight that even professional instructors would have called it remarkable. He held it up without a word, showing it to the room like proof of something larger than just marksmanship. She didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't even smile. Instead, she stepped forward, replaced the shredded target with a fresh one, and sent it sliding back downrange. Her hands moved with that same steady confidence, loading fresh rounds with the ease of someone whose nerves weren't even close to frayed. Carter, sensing the silent judgment building around him, straightened his back and decided he wasn't going to be shown up so easily. "All right then," he said louder now, trying to reclaim authority. "Let's see how you do at double speed. Anyone can take their sweet time lining up shots. It's different when it's fast." There was an edge in his voice, but also desperation. His pride was slipping through his fingers and he was clawing to hold on to it. She didn't even blink. She nodded once as if she had expected this. The officer tilted his head, almost amused. "Fast fire with a .45? He asked. It wasn't common. Controlling rapid fire with that caliber was no small feat. Most shooters sprayed wide after the first shot. Carter folded his arms, staring at her like he was daring her to back down. But she didn't. She took her stance again, exhaled slowly, and raised the weapon. The moment she fired, the air cracked in a staccato rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like thunder rolling in rapid succession. Her arms moved like extensions of the gun, the muzzle rising and snapping back down in perfect control, each shot timed with the kind of precision that comes from more than practice. This wasn't hobby shooting. This was training, deliberate and ingrained into the bones. The paper target jerked violently with each impact, the center blooming wider, jagged holes devouring the silhouette until nothing but shredded fragments remained. She ejected the empty magazine, let the weapon settle on the bench and stepped back. The silence that followed was heavier this time, suffocating in its finality. Carter's face hardened, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed him. His friends didn't laugh anymore. They avoided his eyes, unsure if siding with him meant looking like fools too. "Who the hell are you?" one of them finally asked, the question sharp, cutting through the tension. She looked at him, then at Carter, then back at the range officer who was still holding the ruined target in disbelief. "Just someone who asked for a lane," she said simply. Her voice wasn't boastful, wasn't even defensive, it was matter-of-fact, like the gunfire had spoken louder than anything else could. But the question lingered. Nobody could fire like that, not without years of serious background. Carter knew it too, and the realization was clawing at him. His pride, once inflated by the laughter of his friends, was now suffocating under the weight of his own insecurity. He stepped forward, grabbing a weapon of his own from the bench, a sleek 9mm he clearly favored. "My turn," he said flatly, and stalked into his lane. His buddies exchanged looks. None of them wanted to see this escalate, but none dared intervene. The officer stayed quiet, watching carefully now, sensing the shift from banter to competition. Carter loaded his weapon quickly, slid a new target into place and opened fire. His shots cracked across the room, his arms steady, his stance practiced. He wasn't bad, in fact his grouping was tight, his accuracy commendable. But it wasn't her level. Not even close. His rounds clustered around the center but drifted off slightly, a few straying wide, a couple pulling too far left. By normal standards, it was impressive, the kind of shooting that would earn respect at any range. But compared to the surgical precision she had displayed, it looked sloppy. And the worst part was that Carter knew it. When he lowered his gun, sweat beading along his temple, his target reeled back looking respectable but not perfect. No one applauded. No one said a word. They all knew what he knew, that his best wasn't enough to match what she had just done without even breaking a sweat. She stepped forward again, calm as ever, as if nothing in the room could shake her. Carter opened his mouth to say something, maybe to challenge her further, but she spoke first. "It's not about who's better," she said quietly, her tone steady but firm. "It's about knowing you're not the only one who can be." The word struck harder than any bullet. It wasn't arrogance, it was truth. A reminder that his pride didn't give him ownership of skill, of respect, of the room they stood in. For a long moment, Carter said nothing. His jaw tightened, his eyes flickered, and finally he set his weapon down with a clatter. He turned away, muttering something no one could hear. His friends followed him slowly, their earlier laughter replaced by a heavy silence that clung to them like smoke. The officer, still holding the ruined targets, shook his head with something between disbelief and admiration. She gathered her things with quiet efficiency, slipping the weapon back into its case, wiping down the bench. The room was quieter now, the bravado drained out of it, replaced by something else, respect, maybe even awe. But she didn't linger to enjoy it. She collected her gear, slung her bag over her shoulder, and walked out the same way she came in. Steady, unshaken, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any of the gunfire had outside. The evening air carried the scent of rain, heavy clouds sagging low over the city skyline. She walked calmly across the parking lot, her footsteps steady against the cracked asphalt, the faint echo of her performance still reverberating in her mind. Not the shots themselves, those had been routine, but the silence that followed, the heavy weight of men realizing their assumptions had collapsed in the span of a magazine. She wasn't there to humiliate anyone, wasn't there to prove a point. She had come for practice, the same as always. Yet something about Carter's laughter, the arrogance of it, had stirred something deeper. Not anger but a reminder. A reminder of why she didn't talk much about where she'd learned, about the years carved out of her life by training that left no room for error. She slid into her car, a plain black sedan, and closed the door softly. The silence inside felt different than the silence at the range. This one was calm, grounding. She started the engine and pulled out, headlights slicing through the mist that had begun to settle. Carter, however, wasn't calm. Back inside, his buddies tried to lighten the mood, muttering excuses about how maybe she was some kind of competitive shooter or ex-police, but their words didn't soothe the knot tightening in his chest. He had built his entire identity on being the best shot in the room, the one everyone deferred to, the one whose service overseas was supposed to mean he had nothing left to prove. And then she had walked in, silent, controlled, and dismantled all of it without breaking stride. His friends noticed it too. They weren't laughing anymore. They were whispering, glancing at him as though waiting for him to explode. He clenched his fists, jaw grinding, and finally snapped at them to shut up. They did, but their silence only made his humiliation louder. By the time he stormed out into the damp evening air, his thoughts were racing. Who was she? Nobody shoots like that unless they've been in it deep. Military special units, federal work, something high level. Civilians don't carry that kind of muscle memory. The more he thought about it, the more it burned. He wanted to know. Needed to know. She drove across town, through streets lit by flickering neon and traffic lights reflected in the wet pavement. The city felt alive in its own tired way, but she didn't notice. Her mind wandered, not to Carter or his friends, but to another range years ago, one not open to the public. The walls had been stripped bare, painted matte to kill reflections. The instructors had been relentless, barking corrections until every movement was instinctive. Back then there had been no room for hesitation, no tolerance for wasted shots. Targets weren't paper. They were simulations, hostile silhouettes, scenarios designed to train her body to respond faster than her mind could. She had been younger, less sure of herself, but determined. Determined to earn her place, determined to prove she could survive the gauntlet they put her through. That training had never left her. It was why she walked into public ranges now and then, not to show off but to keep sharp. Skills dulled if you didn't use them, and dull skills got people killed. She turned down a quiet street, her apartment building looming ahead, a modest brick structure tucked between a diner and a laundromat. Normal. Unremarkable. Just the way she liked it. But tonight she couldn't shake the sense that Carter wasn't done. Men like him rarely let go of their pride so easily. She parked, killed the engine, and sat in silence for a moment, eyes on the rearview mirror. A set of headlights rolled slowly past, too slow for her liking, lingering just a second too long before continuing down the block. Her fingers tightened briefly around the steering wheel. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe Carter wasn't going to let the night end at the range. She sighed, grabbed her bag, and stepped out into the misty air. Inside, the apartment was quiet, sparse but functional. No decorations, no clutter. Just clean lines and necessities. She locked the door behind her, double-checked the window latches, and set her bag down. The gun came out first. She stripped it, cleaned it meticulously, and reassembled it with the same calm precision she always carried. Habit. Ritual. Comfort. Across the city, Carter sat in his truck with the engine idling, staring at his phone. A search bar glared back at him. He typed the name he'd overheard at the counter when she handed in her paperwork. He hadn't caught the spelling perfectly, but it was enough. Results came up, scattered, vague. Nothing concrete. No social media presence, no background that fit neatly. That only made him more suspicious. He leaned back, frustration boiling. He'd seen her hands, her stance, her control. This wasn't some weekend hobbyist. His instincts screamed military, but she wasn't one of the standard branches he recognized. There was something else, something hidden. He thought about leaving it alone, about letting the night die quietly, but his pride wouldn't let him. She had embarrassed him in front of his friends, stripped him of the authority he had spent years building. He wanted to know who she was, but more than that, he wanted a chance to prove himself again. To take back what she had taken from him without a word. In her apartment, she poured herself a glass of water and sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the condensation rolling down the glass. Her phone buzzed with a message. An old contact, someone from a world she thought she had stepped out of. It was brief, coded, but clear. Movement in your sector. Stay alert. Her jaw tightened. It wasn't Carter they were warning her about. It was something else. Something bigger. The kind of thing that made her realize tonight's performance at the range might not have gone unnoticed in more ways than one. She exhaled slowly, set the glass down, and went to her closet. From behind a row of ordinary clothes, she pulled out a locked case. When she opened it, the contents gleamed under the soft light. Tools she hadn't touched in months, maybe years, but tools she knew she might need again soon. She stared at them for a long moment, then closed the case quietly. Tomorrow would come, and with it, answers. For now, she prepared. Carter didn't sleep that night. He sat in his truck long after the city had gone quiet, staring through the windshield at nothing, replaying every second of what had happened at the range. The way she had stood there, unshaken, the way her shots had landed like they were guided by something more than muscle and sight. Those images clawed at him, mocking him. He could hear his friends' silence, feel the weight of their doubt pressing against his chest. They had always looked to him as the sharpest, the one who carried authority because he had earned it overseas. But now, all of that had cracked, and she had done it without a word, without even looking at him like he mattered. That was what burned the most, her indifference. He slammed a fist against the steering wheel, veins standing out on his neck, and muttered, "I'll find out who you are." His pride wouldn't allow anything else. He wasn't going to be a forgotten embarrassment, another story whispered in bars about the night some woman walked in and destroyed him. No, he was going to take control of this story even if it meant digging deeper than he should. At the same time, across town, she lay awake in the darkness of her apartment, the coded message replaying in her mind. Movement in your sector. Stay alert. It had been months since she had heard from them, months of quiet she had almost let herself believe was permanent. But this message confirmed what she had always known. The quiet was only ever temporary. She turned onto her side, staring at the shadows crawling across her ceiling, and thought about the tools locked in her closet. She didn't want to use them again. That part of her life was supposed to be over. Yet deep down she knew the truth. Once you carried that kind of skill, that kind of training, there was no such thing as over. It was a weight you carried forever, whether you wanted to or not. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slow, steady breaths. Tomorrow, she told herself. She would assess tomorrow. The morning came gray and heavy, rain streaking down her window in soft lines. She rose early, made her bed with mechanical precision, and moved through her apartment like she was already preparing for something unseen. Every habit, every small ritual, was a remnant of the discipline carved into her bones. She strapped on running shoes, went for a jog through the quiet streets, her eyes scanning everything: windows, alleyways, parked cars, not with paranoia but with instinct. Always reading, always calculating. By the time she returned, her body was warm, her mind sharper. She showered, dressed simply, and checked her phone. Another message blinked across the screen. Different code, but the meaning clear: surveillance compromised. They see you. Her stomach nodded, not with fear but with confirmation. She hadn't imagined it. The lingering headlights last night hadn't been coincidence. Carter might have been watching her, but someone else was too, someone who understood the game at a much higher level. She poured herself coffee, sat at the table, and began mentally cataloging her options. Carter, meanwhile, had finally crashed into a restless sleep in his truck. When he woke, his phone buzzed with messages from his friends, half mocking, half curious, asking if he had found out anything about the woman yet. Their words stung, fueling his determination. He drove aimlessly for a while, his mind locked on the scraps of her name he had overheard, until he found himself parked outside the very diner that sat next to her apartment building. He hadn't planned it, not consciously, but there he was, staring across the street at the modest brick structure, watching people come and go. His gut told him she lived there. He didn't know how he knew. Maybe it was instinct, maybe something about the way she had carried herself when leaving the range. But he trusted that gut the same way he always had in combat zones. And so he sat there, eyes on the door, waiting for her to appear. She noticed him almost immediately. Not him specifically, but the presence. On her way out of the building, her senses pricked at the sight of the truck, the way it was angled toward the entrance, the man slouched in the driver's seat pretending not to stare. She didn't flinch. Instead, she walked to the diner, stepped inside, and took a seat by the window. From there, she could watch him without appearing to. The waitress came by with a smile, poured her coffee, and took her order, but her attention stayed sharp, her body language relaxed only because she had practiced making it so. Through the glass, she saw Carter adjusting in his seat, restless, frustrated. It didn't take long before he got out and crossed the street, storming into the diner with the same heavy steps he had used at the range. She didn't move. She waited until he slid into the booth across from her uninvited, his eyes searching hers with a mix of anger and curiosity. "Who are you?" he demanded, voice low but sharp. She lifted her coffee cup, sipped slowly, and set it back down before answering. "Does it matter?" Her tone was even, calm, but it only fueled his frustration. "Yeah, it matters," he snapped. "You don't just show up and—" He cut himself off, lowering his voice when the waitress passed by. "People don't shoot like that unless they've been trained. Military? CIA? What are you?" His eyes bored into hers, desperate for confirmation. She didn't blink. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but edged with steel. "You're asking the wrong questions, Carter." The use of his name made him freeze. She hadn't been introduced. He hadn't told her. His stomach twisted. She saw the flicker in his eyes and pressed just a little further. "The right question isn't who I am. It's why you're so desperate to know." For the first time since the range, his confidence faltered completely. He swallowed hard, leaning back against the booth. The silence stretched, heavy with tension. And then her phone buzzed again on the table. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly. Another coded warning. This one was clearer, more urgent. "They're closer than you think." Her eyes shifted back to Carter, calm but decisive. "If you want answers," she said quietly, "you're about to get them. Just not the way you expect." The diner's neon sign flickered faintly against the wet glass as the rain picked up, tapping a restless rhythm on the window pane. Carter sat frozen across from her, jaw tight, mind racing, trying to process what she had just said. Her calmness unnerved him more than her shooting ever had. It wasn't arrogance. She carried herself like someone who knew exactly how bad things could get and was already prepared for them. He opened his mouth to press her further, but the faint buzz of her phone on the table drew his eyes. She glanced at the screen again, her expression unreadable, and then slid the phone into her pocket. "We don't have time for this," she said quietly, standing. Carter bristled, instinctively rising as well. "Time for what?" he demanded. She didn't answer, not directly. Instead, she dropped a few bills on the table, nodded politely to the waitress, and walked out into the rain. Against his better judgment, Carter followed. The street was slick with water, cars hissing past as their tires cut through puddles. She moved quickly, not looking back, her stride purposeful. Carter jogged to catch up, frustration boiling. "Hey," he called. "You don't get to just walk away after dropping cryptic lines like that." She stopped then suddenly and turned to face him. The rain beaded on her jacket, her eyes steady, locked onto his. "You think this is about you," she said. "It's not. Whatever you believe you saw at the range, whatever you think you need to prove, it doesn't matter right now. There are bigger problems, and if you keep chasing me, you're going to find yourself right in the middle of them." Carter let out a short, incredulous laugh, though it lacked conviction. "What, like you're in some spy movie? Bigger problems?" But before she could answer, headlights swept too slowly across the street, stopping just a beat too long before turning down the block. She noticed. So did Carter. His laughter died in his throat. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Those people aren't watching you. They're watching me. And you're about to become collateral if you don't get smart." Carter frowned, trying to push down the unease crawling up his spine. "Who are they?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not here." She started walking again, this time turning down a side street where the glow of the diner lights didn't reach. Carter followed, still torn between suspicion and curiosity, but the edge in her voice kept him from pushing too hard. They reached her building, the brick facade dark and uninviting in the rain. She hesitated before the door, scanning the street with a subtle sweep of her eyes, then entered quickly. Carter slipped in behind her, ignoring the sharp look she gave him. "You shouldn't be here," she muttered. "Too late," he replied. Inside, the apartment was dim, spare and clean with nothing personal on the walls. She locked the door behind them, double-checked the windows, then set her bag on the table. Carter stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, dripping rain onto the hardwood, eyes flicking around at the bare surroundings. "You live like you're ready to disappear at a moment's notice," he said. She ignored the comment, pulling out the locked case from her closet and setting it on the table. His eyes narrowed. "What's in there?" She met his gaze, her expression flat. "The reason you should have stayed at the diner." She opened it and Carter's breath caught. Inside lay weapons and gear he recognized, military grade, but not the standard issue he'd been given in his years of service. This was specialized, customized, the kind used by people operating in the shadows. "Jesus," he muttered, stepping closer. "This isn't weekend warrior stuff. This is," he trailed off, realization dawning. She began assembling one of the rifles with calm efficiency, the clicks of metal on metal sharp in the silence. "This is why I told you to walk away," she said softly. Carter's pride wrestled with his instincts. Part of him wanted to storm out, to tell her she was insane, but the soldier in him recognized the truth in what he was seeing. He had been around professionals long enough to know when someone was the real thing. And she was. "You're not military," he said finally, voice low. "At least not in the way I was. So what are you?" She didn't look up as she slid a scope into place. The kind of person who doesn't answer that question. She locked the rifle into place and finally met his eyes. "What I will tell you is this, the people watching us aren't amateurs. And if they've marked me, it won't stop at surveillance." She glanced toward the rain-streaked window. "They'll move sooner rather than later." As if her words summoned it, the distant growl of an engine echoed down the street outside. Carter instinctively moved toward the window, peering through the blinds. A black SUV rolled slowly to a stop across the road, its lights cutting through the mist. The engine idled, too long, too deliberate. Carter felt his chest tighten. "They're here for you," he said quietly. She joined him at the window, her face unreadable. "Not just for me," she corrected. "You've been seen with me now. That means you're in it whether you want it to be or not." His stomach dropped. He thought of walking away, of leaving her to handle whatever this was. But something in her voice, in her calm certainty, told him that if he stepped out now, he wouldn't survive the night. She turned back to the table, checking her gear. "You know how to handle yourself in a fight," she said. It wasn't a question. Carter swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yeah," he admitted. "But I don't even know what kind of fight this is." She handed him a sidearm without hesitation, the weight of it heavy and cold in his hand. "The kind," she said, locking the rifle into place, "that doesn't give you time to ask questions." The low rumble of the SUV's engine seeped through the apartment walls, a steady growl that seemed to vibrate against the floor. Carter stood frozen by the blinds, his grip tightening on the sidearm she had handed him, the weight foreign but familiar at the same time. He had carried a pistol plenty of times overseas, but this felt different. Back then he had a squad at his back, orders in his ear, a uniform that meant he was part of something larger. Now it was just him, standing in a stranger's apartment, staring at an unknown threat parked outside. He glanced at her, half expecting panic, but she was calm, moving through the room with precision, checking her gear, loading magazines, securing weapons like she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. She glanced up at him once, saw the tension in his jaw and said simply, "Stay away from the windows." The tone wasn't sharp, wasn't commanding, but it carried an authority that made him obey without question. He stepped back, his pulse hammering in his ears, the air thick with anticipation. Down on the street, the SUV doors opened with slow deliberation. Two figures stepped out, both in dark clothing that blended with the rain-slicked night. They weren't trying to look casual, they weren't pretending to be anything other than what they were, operators. Carter's gut twisted at the sight. The way they moved, the way they scanned the street, the subtle touches to their earpieces, it was all too familiar. These weren't street thugs or curious neighbors. They were professionals. "How many?" she asked quietly, her hands still working as she sat up near the hallway corner. Carter risked a glance through the blinds. "Two outside. But if they're worth anything, there are more we can't see." She nodded once, as though she had already calculated that. Then assumed 4. Maybe 6. She chambered around in the rifle, the sound clean and sharp, and positioned herself so she could cover the door without being in the line of fire. Carter swallowed hard, his training from years ago trying to resurface, but the doubt gnawed at him. He hadn't been in combat in years. She, on the other hand, looked like she had never stopped. The first knock came, soft but deliberate, 3 raps that carried through the silence of the apartment. Carter's chest tightened. They weren't pretending to be friendly. The rhythm wasn't polite, it was coded, a signal meant for whoever was inside. She didn't move. She waited, eyes fixed on the door, rifle raised but steady. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by a low voice. "We know you're in there. Open up, and this doesn't have to get messy." Carter almost laughed at the absurdity. He had heard that line before in villages half a world away, and it had never been true. She met his eyes briefly, her expression calm but unreadable, and whispered, "When they breach, stay low. Cover my blind side." His throat felt dry, but he nodded. The third knock didn't come. Instead, the sound of boots shifting outside, followed by the creak of metal as someone worked on the lock. Carter's breath caught. They weren't waiting anymore. The door splintered inward with a violent crack, the chain lock snapping like twine. The first man pushed through, weapon raised, but he barely had time to register the room before her shot exploded. The rifle roared, the round tearing into his chest with a force that sent him crashing back into the hall. Carter ducked instinctively, the memory of firefights slamming into his mind, adrenaline flooding his veins. Another figure rushed in, lower, faster, but Carter's instincts kicked in. He dropped to a knee, raised the pistol, and squeezed. The shot went wide, slamming into the wall, but the second one landed, grazing the man's shoulder and spinning him sideways. She didn't hesitate, her follow-up shot dropped him before he could recover. The hallway echoed with chaos now, boots pounding, shouts muffled by the storm outside. They weren't going to stop at the door. They were going to flood the apartment until nothing was left standing. "Move!" she barked, and Carter scrambled to the kitchen as she shifted her position. The third man came through, firing wild bursts into the room. Splinters of wood and shards of plaster erupted around them as bullets chewed through the walls. She returned fire, precise and ruthless, her shots punching through his chest plate until he crumpled. Carter peeked over the counter, his pulse a roaring drum in his ears, and caught sight of a fourth man circling toward the fire escape outside the window. "Left side," he shouted, his voice raw. She pivoted instantly, firing a controlled burst that shattered the glass and caught the man mid-step. His body collapsed against the iron railing, rain washing over him as he slid lifelessly out of view. The silence that followed was jagged, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the rain pounding harder against the glass. Carter's chest heaved as he lowered his pistol, the metallic tang of gunpowder thick in the air. He stared at the body sprawled in the doorway, the blood already spreading dark across the hardwood. His stomach churned, not from the violence itself, he had seen worse, but from the realization that this was only the beginning. She remained calm, checking her weapon, scanning the room with sharp, calculating eyes. "That was the first wave," she said quietly, almost to herself. Carter blinked, his voice shaky. "First wave? You mean there's more?" She nodded, already stripping her rifle, reloading with the same mechanical speed she had shown at the range. "There's always more. They'll regroup, hit harder. We need to move before they box us in." Carter wiped the sweat from his forehead, his pride long forgotten, replaced by a gnawing survival instinct. "Move where?" he asked. She slung the rifle over her shoulder, grabbed the locked case, and looked at him with the calm finality of someone who had already mapped it. Somewhere they don't expect. And you're coming with me, whether you like it or not. The stairwell reeked of mildew and rust, every step echoing too loud for Carter's comfort. His palms were slick against the pistol, the adrenaline from the firefight still crashing through his system like a tidal wave. She moved ahead of him, silent, controlled, the case slung across her back and the rifle angled low. He tried to match her pace, but every creak of the metal stairs felt like a beacon. Outside, the storm hadn't let up. Rain hammered the fire escape, the cold night air slicing against his sweat-soaked shirt. For a moment, Carter's mind wandered back to the apartment above, to the body sprawled across the hardwood, blood mixing with rain from the shattered window. He had fired a gun again after years of trying to forget the way recoil shook through his bones. But what shook him more wasn't the kill, it was the realization that he would be dead right now if not for her. They reached the alley below, the SUV still idling at the curb, headlights cutting pale beams across the slick asphalt. She raised a hand, signaling for him to stop, then crouched low by the dumpster, eyes scanning the street. Carter stayed a step behind, watching her with equal parts awe and confusion. "We can't just run blind," he whispered, but she shook her head, her jaw set. "We're not running blind. We're drawing them out." Before he could question her, she was moving again, darting across the alley in a blur, covering ground with the kind of fluidity he'd only seen in Tier 1 operators. He cursed under his breath and followed, his boots splashing through shallow puddles, his heart pounding in sync with the storm overhead. The SUV's doors swung open just as they neared, and Carter's stomach dropped. Two more men emerged, weapons raised, their black uniforms glinting wet in the dim light. They had been waiting. Carter froze, but she didn't. She fired first, the rifle spitting controlled bursts that forced the attackers to duck behind the open doors. "Cover me," she shouted, and Carter's instincts took over. He dropped behind a trash bin, leveled his pistol, and squeezed. The cracks split the night, one round slamming into the SUV's hood, another shattering the windshield. It wasn't clean, but it was enough to keep their heads down. She surged forward, her shots ripping through the thin sheet metal, one assailant dropping instantly. The second tried to retreat, but she was faster, pivoting, catching him before he could disappear into the shadows. Carter stood frozen, pistol still raised as the echo of gunfire faded into the storm. She didn't waste a second. She pulled the body out of the driver's seat, slid in, and shouted for Carter to move. He blinked, then sprinted, sliding into the passenger side just as she slammed the vehicle into gear. The SUV tore forward, tires screeching against wet asphalt, the force slamming him against the seat. "You're insane," he muttered, gripping the dashboard with white knuckles, but she only kept her eyes on the road, weaving through narrow streets, her breathing steady despite the chaos. "Insane keeps us alive," she replied, her voice low but sharp. He wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the way she handled the wheel, the same way she handled the rifle, told him that this was not the time. The city blurred past, neon lights streaking against rain-streaked glass. Carter finally found his voice. "Who are they? Why are they coming after you?" His tone cracked halfway through, not from fear but from the gnawing frustration of being left in the dark. She exhaled slowly, her knuckles tightening around the steering wheel. "It doesn't matter who they are. What matters is they won't stop." Carter slammed a fist against the dash. "That's not good enough. You just dragged me into a war and you expect me to, what? Follow orders like I'm still in uniform?" She glanced at him, and for the first time, there was something softer in her eyes, a flicker of recognition. "You're not here by accident, Carter. You've been part of this since you walked into that range." The words hit harder than any bullet. He turned to face her fully, the storm outside momentarily forgotten. "What the hell does that mean?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned sharply, pulling the SUV into an underground parking garage, the echo of the engine bouncing off concrete pillars. She killed the lights, guided the vehicle into the shadows, and finally allowed herself to breathe. "It means," she said quietly, "that you're not just some washed-up soldier trying to drink away the years. They knew you'd find me. They knew you'd recognize me. And they knew you wouldn't walk away." Carter stared at her, his pulse quickening for reasons beyond fear. Recognize her? He searched his memory, combing through old deployments, missions long buried. Her face swam in his mind, familiar in a way he couldn't place. His voice was a whisper now, fragile. "We've met before, haven't we?" Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching, and though she didn't answer, the silence said more than words ever could. Carter leaned back, the pistol heavy in his lap, his thoughts spinning. The firefight, the chase, the relentless enemies, none of it made sense. But her? She did. Somewhere, somehow, Their paths had crossed in the blood-soaked past, and now that past had clawed its way back into the present. He wanted to demand more, to piece it all together, but before he could speak, she tilted her head, listening. The faint hum of engines drifted into the garage, growing louder by the second. Carter's breath caught. They had been tracked. She chambered another round, her expression hardening once more. "We move again," she said, her voice steady as stone. This time no hesitation. The rumble of engines grew louder in the concrete hollow, vibrating through the steering wheel and the soles of Carter's boots. He tightened his grip on the pistol, but his hands shook, not from fear of the fight ahead but from the storm raging in his mind. She sat perfectly still beside him, her breathing calm, her rifle angled toward the exit ramp. The way she waited, every muscle coiled yet loose, reminded him of snipers he'd once seen, predators who could sit for days until the right second arrived. Her voice cut through the heavy silence. "You're going to see the truth tonight, Carter? Just promise me when it comes you won't freeze." He almost laughed, bitter and hollow. "Freeze? I've been drowning in ghosts since the desert. You drag me into this and expect me to play soldier again? Tell me what the hell is going on." She turned to him then, her eyes sharper than any blade. "Fallujah. 2005, the name carved through his chest like shrapnel." He blinked, his mouth dry as memories he had fought to bury clawed their way back. The raid on the compound, the collapsed stairwell, the screams echoing in the smoke. And through it all, a girl, no older than 16, who had picked up a rifle heavier than her arms and fired at the insurgents tearing through her home. He remembered her face in flashes, dust-streaked, blood at her temple, eyes burning with defiance. He remembered dragging her out after the blast, his ears ringing, his squad shouting for evac. He remembered leaving her in the hands of intelligence officers who swore she'd be safe. He had believed them because he wanted to. Because he couldn't face the weight of one more broken promise. Now, sitting in the shadow of a parking garage 15 years later, that girl had become the woman beside him. His chest tightened as the realization crashed in, leaving him reeling. "It was you," he whispered, his throat raw. She gave the faintest nod. "They didn't save me, Carter. They turned me into this. They taught me how to shoot, how to disappear, how to kill. Every bullet I've fired since that night has been because of the people you trusted." Her words cut deeper than any wound, each syllable dripping with betrayal and grief. Carter's pulse hammered. He wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but he couldn't. He had seen too much of what the system did to survivors, to innocents, to anyone caught in the machine. The headlights of approaching vehicles spilled into the garage entrance, snapping him back. 3 black SUVs rolled in, engines snarling like beasts. Armed men spilled out, boots slapping wet concrete, their movements precise and rehearsed. Carter counted at least a dozen, maybe more. Trap. She slid out of the SUV with liquid grace, taking cover behind a pillar, her rifle already aimed. "We fight or we die," she said flatly. Carter swallowed the lump in his throat and followed, planting his back against cold cement. He raised his pistol, feeling the familiar weight anchor him. For the first time in years, the fog in his head cleared. The war wasn't over. It had just come home. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the enclosed space. Muzzle flashes lit the garage like lightning, sparks dancing off concrete as rounds ricocheted. Carter fired in measured bursts, each shot guided not by training manuals but by muscle memory burned into his bones. Beside him, she moved like a phantom, every trigger pull efficient, every shift of stance perfect. 2 men dropped, then 3. Grenade clatters echoed off the walls. She kicked it back before it could detonate, the blast shaking dust from the ceiling. The firefight stretched into a blur of sound and smoke, his veins surging with adrenaline, until the chaos dulled into silence once more. Bodies littered the concrete, steam rising off, blood mixing with rainwater dripping through cracks in the ceiling. But they weren't done. The last SUV's back door swung open and a man stepped out, tall, composed, wearing the smugness of authority like armor. He carried no weapon, only a folder tucked beneath his arm. His voice carried easily across the garage. "You've run long enough." She stiffened, lowering her rifle slightly, her eyes narrowing. Carter felt the tension radiating from her as if the air itself had turned to steel. "That's him," she muttered, her voice venom. Carter recognized the type immediately, the kind of handler who smiled while pulling puppet strings. "You were never free," the man continued, stepping closer, boots echoing. "Everything you've done, every shot you've taken, it was all under our direction. Even tonight. Especially tonight. And you, Sergeant Carter, your little reunion was scripted the day she was taken in." The words hit Carter like a gut punch. He saw her tremble, her iron control cracking. She had been used her entire life, molded into a weapon, every step manipulated by the very people she thought she had escaped. His blood boiled, rage igniting something he thought had died years ago. He stepped forward, pistol raised, voice steady. You think you own her? You think you can use people like tools and walk away? Not tonight. The handler sneered, opening the folder, its pages filled with classified orders, signatures, surveillance photos, even Carter's own name among them. You were always part of it, Sergeant. You just never realized. The garage seemed to shrink, the storm above roaring louder, time itself bending under the weight of the moment. She met Carter's eyes then, searching, pleading without words. And he understood. This wasn't about orders, missions, or governments anymore. It was about breaking free. He squeezed the trigger. The handler collapsed instantly, the folder scattering across the wet concrete like leaves. Silence reclaimed the garage, broken only by the soft hum of rainwater dripping. Carter lowered his weapon, his chest heaving. She stood frozen, staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. Slowly, she slung the rifle over her shoulder, stepping closer. Now what? She asked, her voice low, fragile in a way he had never heard. Carter exhaled, the weight of the past and present pressing down on him. He looked at her, no longer the girl he'd once tried to save, no longer the weapon they had tried to make of her, but something new, someone who had carved her own survival through fire. Now, he said, sliding the pistol into his holster, we decide for ourselves. For the first time she allowed herself the smallest, sharpest smile. Together they walked out of the garage into the storm, leaving the corpses, the lies and the chains behind. The night swallowed them, but this time it wasn't as prey. It was as predators finally freed. The end.